Well, welcome again to History by Lou. I hope you're going to enjoy this episode. We're going to tackle the Industrial Revolution, but this is such a big topic that it has to be 4 parts. And so the one we're going to talk about today will be the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, actually the late 18th century and into the 19th century. And as you watch it, I want you to ask yourself 3 questions. First of all, why did the Industrial Revolution begin in Great Britain, or more properly in England itself? Second question is, why were textiles the first area to be industrialized, both in England and in the United States a little bit later? And finally, what was the most important development that took place in the early part of the 19th century relative to the Industrial Revolution? So those are our questions. That's our subject. So let's get going. Well, for this adventure in history, we're going to go back to the very beginning of the things that make a huge difference in our lives. We're going to take a look at the first industrial revolution in America, which ran roughly from 1790 to the eve of the Civil War in 1860. This is an antebellum period, ante meaning before and bellum meaning war, before 1861. In 1790, most of the things Americans bought were imported, made at home, or produced in small shops. By 1860, American factories and technology were often the envy of their international rivals. In less than a century, new machines, new sources of power, and new ways of organizing work had transformed the United States from an agricultural nation to a great industrial power. So what were the sectors that made a change? Communication. This was the advent of the telegraph and fast printing presses, which allowed written information to travel faster so people could share ideas more quickly, which stimulated other new ideas. Transportation changed. We had steam-based transportation introduced on both trains and boats. Manufacturing. The American system of manufacturing made store-bought goods cheaper. Here's a print from the mid-19th century, which is sort of idealized, but it shows all of the great new inventions from that period, called the progress of the century. Among those things was the lightning steam press, which was very fast, where they combined the rotary press with the steam power, the electric telegraph, which sent ideas around the world and around the nation quickly, the locomotive, which helped people to transport goods and materials and people simply and easily, and the steamboat, which did it by water. The roots of the Industrial Revolution begin actually with the impact of the Agricultural Revolution. Then we're going to define this Industrial Revolution, take a look at some of the innovators and inventions from Britain, where it really began. The Agricultural Revolution began in Britain during the 18th century. The Agricultural Revolution created a huge increase in food production with fewer farmers. This led to population growth and mobility. People began to move around and have more babies, providing workers for the Industrial Revolution that followed. Many factors caused the agricultural revolution, including the enclosure system, new agricultural tools and inventions, use of fertilizers and nitrogen-fixing crops, and the development of agrarian capitalism. The agricultural revolution directly contributed to the industrial revolution because there was now a surplus of food to feed the workers in the new factories. No longer would the majority of the population earn their living from farming. Here's a picture of an 18th century grist mill where grain is ground into flour. And this is the way it really began. They would find a stream or a river, and they would construct a wheel, a water wheel that would pick up the power from the moving water and translate it into machinery. Here's a chart that shows the reduction in the number of labor hours needed to produce crops as a result of the agricultural revolution. It continued to decline and decline rapidly. The Industrial Revolution started in Great Britain during the 18th century. A series of inventions for the textile, which is cloth and cloth products industry, led to the creation of factories. Previously, much of that work was done in homes or in small workshops. Key inventors were people like John Kay, James Hargreaves, Richard Arkwright, Samuel Crompton, Edmund Cartwright, Thomas Savery, Thomas Newcomen, and James Watt, all dealing with steam engines. Textiles, by the way, were the first mass-produced item of the Industrial Revolution. It's because that's what they were familiar with, and they knew how to envision how they would be able to adapt this to machinery. So the Industrial Revolution began in the late 18th, early 19th century with power-driven machinery, which was invented to manufacture goods. It fundamentally changed the ways agricultural, manufacturing, and transportation were done. The Industrial Revolution had a profound effect on socioeconomic and cultural conditions in Britain and later spread throughout Europe, North America, and eventually the world. The Industrial Revolution is a major turning point in human history, comparable to the invention itself of farming or the rise of the first city-states. Almost every aspect of daily life in human society was transformed. Here are the steps in fiber and wool, translating it from the rough material into cloth and textiles. First, you have to clean and harvest and clean the fiber or the wool. Then you card and spin it into thread and weave the thread into cloth and sew the cloth into final products like clothes, blankets, rugs, and handkerchiefs. Down in the lower left, you see two carding tools. When I grew up, those were sitting around in the house and had just recently been used because that's how you translated the rough wool into long fibers that could then be spun into thread, which is then used in that weaving machine. And people some days as crafts still do the home weaving. So before, you had a dramatic difference, people working in their home in small groups and then great big factories afterwards. The lady spinning on the spinning wheel at her own home, and then later the spinning was done in massive factories. John Kay invented the flying shuttle in 1733. Flying shuttles improved looms and greatly increased the output of the weavers. Some weavers who feared the flying shuttle would put them out of work damaged Kay's home and workshop. See, fear of something new. His invention, however, was a great success, and the textile industry was soon copied for others using it, and it was ruined Kay financially. James Hargreaves was given credit for the invention of the spinning jenny. Many scholars believe that the original inventor was somebody by the name of Thomas Hyes, and that Hargreaves was responsible for making major improvements to Hyes' invention. And that was often the case, where somebody would come up with an idea or invention, then someone else would study it, and they'd figure out a better way of refining it and making it even better. The spinning jenny enabled one person to do the work of 8 spinning wheels. Like John Kay, Hargreaves' home and workshop were attacked and his invention was copied and improved upon. Richard Arkwright built the first water-powered cotton spinning mill in 1771. His invention, known as the water frame, began the process that moved textile production from home to factory. He became very wealthy, and members of his family married into the British aristocracy. Samuel Crompton invented a machine that combined Hargreaves' spinning jenny and Arkwright's water frame. And again, you see combining old ideas into new ones. A spinning mule had a great impact on the spinning industry. It could produce stronger and finer yarns, and when powered by steam engines, could spin thousands of spindles all at once. Crompton also faced danger from machine breakers and had to hide his machine for a time. Here we see the factory. Now, let me mention that woman has long hair, and people who worked in the factories, and a substantial number of them were women, had long hair. And it was not unheard of for women to get their hair caught in the fast-moving machinery and even be scalped. Now, it didn't happen all that often, but it did happen enough so that it was a hazardous kind of a thing. All of the machineries were handled. There was no OSHA during this period. Edmund Cartwright, inspired after viewing the water frame, he invented the power loom in 1787, which used steam engines to power a mechanical weaving machine. He made very little money from his invention because the factory that installed his machines was destroyed by workers who feared losing their jobs. Later, his invention was copied by many mill owners. To show their appreciation, however, for his invention, the British Parliament gave him a large sum of money in 1809. Luddites, those people who are unwilling to accept new ideas or new technology, are often called Luddites. England was a distressed country in 1811 to 1813. In 1812, the government was fearful. Much of the army was overseas fighting both the French and the Americans. See, not only were they fighting our War of 1812, they were fighting in the Napoleonic Wars on the continent. England was experiencing the worst trade depression since the 1760s, and people were suffering great hardship. What were the causes? The poverty, harsh economic times because of the Napoleonic Wars, and non-enforcement of the laws, and there weren't very many of them, meant to protect the workers. And the minimum wage bill of 1808 actually decreased wages for the people in the United Kingdom and England. Deteriorating working conditions. The factories were becoming increasingly dangerous. Combination Acts banned trade unions. Mechanical looms and spinners replaced skilled craftsmen. Who were the Luddites? The 19th century English handicraftsmen. Ned Ludd, that's supposedly his caricature on the right, was an apprentice who smashed his boss's shearing frame with a hammer. Was he a mythic hero? Was Ned Ludd really a real person or just a mythical person? He was supposed to have lived in Sherwood Forest. Ned Ludd was supposed to have been an idiot boy, that all he could do was wreck and destroy, and he turned to his workmates and said, "Death to machines." Middleton Guardian report said this: "At least 7 people have been killed after a day of Luddite rioting that brought terror to the populace of Middleton. Up till now, the town has been spared the attention of the followers of the infamous Ned Ludd from Lancashire, whose resentment of the coming of the power-driven loom has spawned bands of machine wreckers. It has been feared for some time that Middleton could become the target for these agitators, for many of the town's loom houses have fallen silent." More on that report. But no one could have foreseen the mayhem that ensued today on the 2nd of April of 1812. Men armed with clubs, staves, and rakes came into the town from all directions. They congregated at the top of the Middleton, entered the shops, and began to fill their pockets with the goods on the shelves, throwing the flour and sugar about the floor and generally causing havoc. The government's response to the Luddites felt it had to establish control. It had to provide a good business climate, had to repress and control the unruly groups. No attempt was made to alleviate the cause of the social disruption. And so, the end of Luddism. The male workers actually gained the right to vote as a result of it. Trade unions were legalized. 49 Luddites were killed by in riots by government forces. 24 were actually executed, and 34, as another punishment often used during this time, were transported to Australia, which was viewed as the end of the world. More than 20 others were given long-term prison sentences. Political consequences: it changed the views of many of the influential people, brought the rights of the workers to the attention of the public. It began a debate about industrialization, a look at the positive and negative effects of industrialization. The government could no longer ignore the plight of the workers. Technology is never neutral. It always has an enduring impact. A word about steam power. Using water as a power source had disadvantages. The factory had to be built near running water, and the water wheel could not work during freezing weather. The steam engine allowed factories to be built anywhere because they did not need flowing water. The first successful steam engines were developed by Thomas Savery and Thomas Newcomen in the early 18th century. In 1781, James Watt developed a compound steam engine after improving the earlier Newcomen engines in 1769. In 1790, steam-powered textile factories were built. Notice these dates. They are far apart. And so while there was a Newcomen engine in 1769, James Watt didn't get around to his next stage of it until 1781. And then a real factory doesn't come for another 9 years. And so we sort of, when we read these things, we think they maybe happened bing, bang, boom, but they didn't. They took place over long periods of time. Here again, you see widely spaced dates, 1705 and 1784. The steam engine was crucial to the progress of the Industrial Revolution. For the first time, a portable power source could be used to power factories anywhere, freeing them from the limitations of water power. By the early 19th century, steam engines were used for land and sea transport. Here is a picture of a Watt steam engine. This is a late version of his double-acting steam engine, and it's in a facility in Madrid, Spain. There's also a there's also a version of it in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And they're really pretty much the same today. If you are dealing with a steam engine, and there are still some out there. The Quarterly Review of London in 1830 said this: unlike muscle power, it never tired or slept or refused to obey. Unlike water power, its immediate predecessor, it ran in all seasons and all weathers. Unlike the same. Unlike wind, it responded tractably to human will and imagination, turning on and off, undulating smoothly from the finest delicacy to the greatest force, ever under responsive control. It's impossible to contemplate without feeling exaltation this wonder of the American art. So the Industrial Revolution then comes to America too. Early inventors: John Fitch, Oliver Evans, John Stevens, Samuel Slater, Eli Whitney, and John H. Hall. So here's a timeline. 1784, Oliver Evans builds an automated milling plant. 1786, John Fitch builds a model steam-powered boat, and then he makes his first successful trial on the Delaware a year later. In 1790, begins passenger service from Philadelphia with even more improvement. 1789, Samuel Slater escaped England. He had to go out in disguise and arrived in New York with spinning machine technology. Slater, Brown, and Almay opened the first water-powered cotton spinning mill in the Blackstone River in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. This is often called the beginning of the American Industrial Revolution. 1782, George Anschutz opened America's first blast furnace in Pittsburgh. And Eli Whitney, as we know, patented the cotton gin in 1793, and all of the tremendous social changes that came with that, in addition to economic. Friend Oliver Evans, the most important invention was an automated grist mill where grain was ground into flour. He made improvements in the textile industry, developed and improved a high-pressure steam engine, designed several land and water vehicles that used his high-pressure steam engine for propulsion. Like most early American inventors, he was ahead of his time and could not find backers for his advanced mechanical projects. Just want to mention a word, too, about steam engines. In the beginning, at least, many of them, until they learned how to regulate them better, blew up because you're putting a tremendous amount of pressure under confinement. But they eventually managed to get it under control. But in the beginning, many people died that way. Oliver Evans' most important invention was an automated grist mill, which operated continuously through the use of bulk material handling devices, included bucket elevators, conveyor belts, and Archimedean screws. Fascinating to watch these if you're ever there. Oliver Evans is quoted as saying the following in 1800. He says, "The time will come when people will travel in stages moving by steam engines from one city to another, almost as fast as birds can fly, 15 or 20 miles an hour. A carriage will start from Washington in the morning. The passengers will breakfast at Baltimore, dine at Philadelphia, and sup in New York on the same day. Engines will drive boats 10 to 12 miles an hour." John Fitch, skilled craftsman and inventor, who built the first steamboat in America in 1786. He also invented a small steam locomotive and demonstrated it to George Washington and his cabinet. Here's a model of it. Fish was ahead of his time, and an agricultural U.S. was not ready for his invention. John Stevens encouraged Americans to develop steam power for both on land and water. He was a wealthy, socially prominent inventor. His ship, the Phoenix, was the first steamboat to travel on the ocean. In the 1820s, he built a small train on his estate in New Jersey that ran on circular tracks, reaching speeds of, can you imagine this, 12 miles an hour. His sons became railroad pioneers, making many improvements to railroad technology. Samuel Slater, born in England in 1768, he was apprenticed to a partner of Arkwright's for 8 years, during which time he became superintendent of the cotton mill and learned how the Arkwright machines and mill operated. In 1789, he emigrated secretly to America. The British government had laws forbidding skilled mechanics from leaving. While the textile industry was long established in Great Britain, it was just starting in America, and Slater believed he could become wealthy in America's infant textile industry. He was the first immigrant with textile experience, but he was not the first with textile experience, but the first one who knew how to build and operate textile machinery. By 1790, Slater and his partners built one of the first factories in America on the Blackstone River in Rhode Island. In 1793, they built Slater Mill, the first American factory to successfully produce cotton yarn with water-powered machines. Within a few years, there were hundreds of mills and factories turning out cotton yarn, and that's a picture of it today. You can go and visit. This is the old Slater Mill historic site. Slater's mill replaced the primitive in the household with the massive factory, with lots of wheels and spinning things, doing lots of production. Inside Slater's mill, you saw all kinds of machinery doing the spinning in its various stages that need to occur. Slater Mill today, there it is, Pawtucket, Rhode Island, worthy of a visit if you're up in that area. Our friend Eli Whitney, inventor and entrepreneur, invented the cotton gin, or was it developed by slaves? We'll never know. Slaves at that time were very inventive too, and they were the ones who were suffering, having to pick the cotton and to somehow sort out the seeds from it and to make any usefulness out of it. So it could be that they had come up with the ideas that he applied and patented. Popularized the system of interchangeable parts later on. His innovations greatly impacted American history. The cotton gin. There's a small model on the right. It's an ancient crop. Cotton itself is an ancient crop first grown in both South America and India 6,000 years ago. Only rare sea island or long staple cotton could be grown profitably before Eli Whitney's invention. Short staple cotton, a species that could be grown in wider areas, was unsuitable because it contained hundreds of seeds that had to be removed by hand. And there's sharp little points in there, and it was a nasty business to do it. He invented a machine that mechanically removed the seeds and made short staple cotton a viable crop. Jefferson wrote a letter in 1793 in reply to Whitney's application for his patent. Jefferson gives Whitney the requirements to obtain a patent and asks for more information because he's interested in purchasing a gin for his cotton plantation in Virginia. Whitney's patented cotton gin was soon copied by many others, and he spent years and thousands of dollars trying to uphold his patent. And here, as I said, is the original model. It's at the National Museum of American History. When Whitney's invented his machine, the House was at a turning point regarding slavery. South was at a turning point. The high cost of maintaining slaves made the crops produced by slave labor, such as tobacco, indigo, and rice, less profitable. The cotton gin changed this by making short staple cotton the most profitable cash crop. Cotton production required cheap labor, and the demand for slaves exploded. Slavery became a permanent fixture. Few, if any, Southerners spoke out against it. They were making a lot of money. Why not rock the boat? Slavery was the backbone of the prosperous economic system in the South. It's estimated that in the 11 southern states, income derived from slave labor ranged from 17 to over 30%. Here's a famous painting of the application of the cotton gin. Whitney and his partner, and he had a partner, Phineas Miller, set up cotton gins throughout the South. Instead of charging money, Whitney took 2/5 of the crop farmers brought to him to be ginned. Farmers, angry at that high price, began making their own versions of the cotton gin, and after a long and largely unsuccessful struggle, Whitney just gave up defending his patent and returned to New Haven, Connecticut in 1798. But he's not done yet. Cotton exports in pounds before and after the retention of the cotton gin. From less than 200,000 in 1791, it rose to 40 million in only 12 years. From 200,000 to 40 million in 12 years. Growth in the number of slaves after the invention of the cotton gin. From 750,000 in 1790, the number of slaves reached over 4 million by 1860. Cotton as a percent of U.S. exports, 1800 to 1860. By 1850, America was growing 3/4 of the world's supply of cotton. The majority of southern cotton was shipped to New England or exported to Great Britain, where it was turned into cloth. Another little note, today the U.S. is third in the world as the world's leader in cotton production behind India and China. So where we see the growth of cotton production and bales and slave population, both of which were accelerating dramatically from 1790 up through 1860. Eli Whitney and the American system of manufacturing. As the Napoleonic Wars broke out in Europe, Whitney knew that the U.S. Army would need a new source for muskets to arm its soldiers. Traditionally, muskets have been made one at a time by skilled craftsmen. No two muskets were alike, and the parts from one would not fit another. Whitney proposed to produce muskets with interchangeable parts. He demonstrated his procedure to government officials, who gave him a contract. The contract called for Whitney to produce 10,000 muskets in 2 years. It took Whitney 8 years to fulfill the contract. A second contract called for him to produce 15,000, which he accomplished in 2 years. So he finally got it right. It took him a while to do it. He invented a new system using high precision tools to manufacture parts. The parts could be assembled by any unskilled worker and were entirely interchangeable. So here again, you have one idea that's going to lead to another breakthrough in terms of the machine industry, which will have its great application in many, many different ways beyond the muskets that they were manufacturing. Here's Whitney's arms factory rather. It was later sold to the Winchester Repeating Arms Company and today is a museum. Of course, we don't know the Winchester name today is still viable. The U.S. government complained that Whitney's muskets were more expensive than those of other manufacturers. Whitney showed them through an early use of the now common business practice of cost accounting that his were not overpriced. So you see, he's learning how to do something additional. And here is a diagram of one of his rifles and an actual picture of one. Nice collector's items if you can find one for a price you can afford. Whitney had to invent new machines to fulfill his contract. Some historians credit him with cheating. In any event, it's sometimes called the American system of manufacturing. The system involved the use of power machinery, interchangeable parts, and division of labor. Whitney came up with new ideas about manufacturing and made a lasting contribution to the Industrial Revolution in America. So it was far beyond just his invention of the cotton gin. A remarkable history. John H. Hall had developed interchangeable parts and laid a solid foundation for the American system of manufacture and mass production too. In 1819, Hall was given a contract by the U.S. government to produce 1,000 of his patented breech-loading rifles. He built his workshop at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, spent the first years creating precision machinery for making rifles with interchangeable parts. He spent the next 2 decades perfecting precision machines that were the models of modern milling machines. Hall's inventions and innovations allowed unskilled workers to perform tasks that were traditionally done by skilled craftsmen, paving the way for factory production. So he too is a great inventor and a person who deserves a lot of credit. There are pictures of Harper's Ferry, which of course will play a role with John Brown in the Civil War period leading up to the Civil War. And so here we have the end of the first part of a look at the Industrial Revolution. And actually, we need to note that the beginning of everything that's made today had its first start in this Industrial Revolution, but there's much more to come later on. And so remember to hit the subscribe and like buttons so I can be encouraged to create more History by Lou. And I thank you for listening today, and I hope you had an enjoyable experience and learned something useful in your life.